Hello.
Good morning.
To begin with, can I ask you to say your name?
Yes, it's Vicky Baril, or Baril. There's different ways of pronouncing it. Baril. It's a French name, and so you can say it however you wish. We usually go by Baril.
Baril.
Yes.
And if you don't mind taking us back to the years in the 70s, could you describe for us your life? Where were you living? What were you doing for a living?
Okay, let's just go to 73 when we moved from Edmonton from an apartment with our 3 preschool children we built a home on an acreage out by Spruce Grove. And so in 73 we built the home, and then in 75 we had child number 4. And my husband was a school teacher and I was a stay-at-home mom. I did work part-time evenings prior to that, but for Imperial Oil, whom I'd had worked for when I first came to Edmonton in the key punch department. And then after 1975, when a child number 4 was born, I stayed home. And then in about 1978, my husband and I started a small bee operation, an apiary, and well, small, it was 100 hives. And so that kept us very busy in the summertime. And so that's where we were in the 70s. And then, of course, very busy with raising our own family and so on. And yeah.
So my impression of that is that Spruce Grove, where you were living, is a rural area?
Well, Spruce Grove is now a city. It's about 15 miles west of Edmonton, and we are about 10 miles west of Edmonton right now. And yes, we are in a rural area ourselves, in a subdivision. Yeah.
Do you remember at that time, or even a few years before then, what were your impressions of the Vietnam War or the Southeast Asian War?
Well, that's an interesting question, because I think I shamefully have to admit that I wasn't aware of really any of those things going on. We were busy in our 30s raising 4 children and just trying to make ends meet, and to speak of any wars going on, we'd hear it on the news, but never ever realized the impact it had on the world or the refugees or the immigrants or anyone else. And you know, you'd hear it on the news and kind of unfortunately it just kind of passed over us, and we didn't really know anything about it until when we were going to the Enoch Church on the Enoch Reserve. It's Our Lady of Mission, Our Lady of Mercy Parish. And we had a wonderful priest there by the name of Father Gilles Gauthier. And he was the one who initiated this whole sponsorship program for our group. And he announced from the pulpit that there were going to be over 100,000 immigrants coming to Canada, and that we should seriously think of sponsoring a family. And to seriously think of sponsoring a family, not just the regular mom, dad, and a couple of children, but perhaps a family that would be a little more difficult to sponsor, one that people might shy away from. So that was the seed that he planted, and then he came up with, through Catholic Social Services, he said, we have found a family, and it's a widow with 6 children.
Do you remember what year was that he made that announcement from the pulpit?
Well, it had to be just, I would say, maybe 6 months or so before the refugees even arrived, because that's when the whole sponsorship program got into being, I believe. But that's 40 years ago, so you know, a lot of those details I can't say that I'm right on.
And what were you learning about Vietnamese refugees at that moment?
We were learning that they were in dire straits, and that many people had come over. They talked about the boat people, that many people were on boats, and many people were losing their lives. And so basically that was the extent of what we knew about it. You know, in later on we realized that the USA was part of the Vietnamese War, which was a bad part of the war. And we didn't even realize at that time how serious that was. So when families were coming to Canada, we just thought, oh, hey, that's great, we can help them out, and just move forward with that.
What were your thoughts when the priest made that announcement? What did you envision with
I think
your involvement?
Initially we were envisioned this is a great idea, and he asked for people to come forward, and we had a meeting, and there was initially 4 or 5, maybe 6 or 7 families, and the initial sponsorship group was approximately 5 families, and then we had moral support from other groups, other families, but initially 5 kind of just jumped into it, and you know, we just did what we had to do. It was, we were, like I say, in our 30s, and never thought of, is this a lot of work, or is this, what is this? And we just, honestly, it was heartwarming when you think of all the people that came together, and some of them definitely were, all of them we knew very well from the parish. They were basically our friends, and just move forward.
What moved you? What compelled you to get involved?
What compelled us? You know, I think probably just what we had seen from our own parents of helping other people, not immigrants necessarily, but people who were not that well off, or my relatives that came to Canada, my mother's sister and my father's brother. They always helped them out just to make sure that they got established. And I don't think they weren't financially dependent on our family in any way, but I think we just saw the goodness in doing good for other people.
So your own parents had helped out relatives who immigrated to Canada?
Yes, they had. And you know, when we were I was thinking about this little story. It's maybe insignificant, but when we were on the farm in Swan River,
Where's that?
In Swan River, Manitoba, we had a group of native ladies that would go up about a mile north of our place, and they had a campsite up there, the indigenous people, and we could hear powwows going on up there and so on. And the native ladies would stop in at our farm and buy cream. They loved the farm cream. And I remember in those days it was 15 cents a pint and 30 cents a quart.
This is when you were in your childhood?
Oh, in my childhood. I was about 7 or 8. And they would stop and buy cream, and about every 3rd time that they would come, my mother would give them the cream. She didn't charge them for it. And I never asked her, why aren't you charging her? Or, you know, there's so many questions that as I got older, I wished I would have asked, but I didn't. But I can see why, you know, it was just a nice gesture to help someone out. And so even those little things, they stay with you. They stay with you.
So your parents' relatives were immigrants. Were your parents also immigrants?
Yes, my parents were immigrants. My father came to Canada in about 1929, and my mother came in 1933.
From where?
From Germany. And my father came with 2 brothers to farm, because in those days the rule in Germany was that the oldest son would inherit the farm, and neither of these 3 boys were the oldest, so they decided to come to Canada. So they landed at Pier 21, and then they moved west to Regina, and I don't know what compelled them to come to Regina. There must have been maybe government offerings of, you know, breaking the land or whatever was in those days. And eventually 2 of my uncles went back to Germany just before the Second World War. I think it was my grandfather was ailing, and so they went back. And then eventually one of the uncles came back in 1945, and he lived here the rest of his life. And my mother came in 1933. She had been corresponding with my father through letters, and so how these long distance relationships go. I guess we have the internet now to to do that. But they got together. My mother came to Canada in 33. She came to Regina, and on the 29th of July of 1933. And the rule in those days was that you had to be married within 2 weeks. Otherwise, you have to go back to your homeland. So she came right at the end of July. And in those days also, the rule in the Catholic Church was that you had to announce your banns. They called them banns. You had to announce your intention of marriage for at least 3 weeks before you got married. So there wasn't time for announcing banns. So my mother, being the very practical woman that she was, she said, well, we're going to the Anglican Church in Lumsden, Saskatchewan, and that's where we're going to get married. So they got married on the 15th of August, 1933, in Lumsden, Saskatchewan. And then I remember my mother telling my husband this story of this happening, and my husband says, oh, so did you have your marriage blessed in the Catholic Church? My mother said, yes, we did. In November, then we went and had our marriage blessed in the Catholic Church. And you have to know my husband to appreciate that. But it was beautiful, and so they carried on from there.
And that spirit of helping out the newcomers, and
yeah, it was
got passed down to you somehow.
Yes, it did. I know in Swan River, Manitoba, when it came thrashing time, my father always hired an Indigenous man by the name of Louis Fleury. The Fleurys were a family of natives in Swan River, and Louis Fleury always was hired by my dad for thrashing season. My mother was friends with the mother, Martha Fleury, and I remember going to school with Mary Fleury and, you know, being friends with her. And so it was just a common thing. It wasn't, you know, I don't remember anyone thinking, oh, they're native, or this one is that, or it wasn't part of it at all. It really wasn't. I don't know whether maybe my parents coming from Germany had seen so much of that it was just not part of a household that we were growing up in. And so, yes, so it was always, my parents didn't have a lot, but they were very generous.
And not to get too deep into it, but I can't help thinking about your father arriving in 1929, your mum arriving in 1933. That was like, the Depression was like all of the rage, or just about to happen.
It was the Dust Bowl,
in Saskatchewan.
In Saskatchewan. Like, when I look back at it, I think my mother, who had come from a very privileged background of nurses and nannies, and came from a family of 7 children, and her father was a mining manager, and they had all the you could want in Germany at that time. And for her to come to Saskatchewan, I thought, wow. She had to be a very strong person to be able to endure that transition. Wow. When she came to Regina and her brother-in-law picked her up at the train station with the horses and the wagon, she said they drove to the farm with the team and the wagon slithered on the road from the grasshoppers. And she came into this little farmhouse, and there were no mattresses on the bed. And she thought, wow, what do these people sleep on here? But, you know, I guess the men thought it wise, and they had the mattresses airing out on the clothesline. See, there was a woman coming into the house. They wanted to get it as freshened up as they could, I'm assuming. So they had their good little stories, and their, you know.
They had their own immigrant, a pretty hard time.
Yes.
Immigrating too, probably.
Yes, they did, but you know, they didn't dwell on that. They just moved forward. And I think being in a farming community, you could always look after your food. My mother was very practical, you know, from the flour that they bought by the big flour in the bags. She would make sheets for the beds and whatever she could from the flour bags. And my dad was a very, very practical man. He was like a self-taught butcher. He would butcher a pig and a beef in the fall, and they would make smoked ham and bacon, and oh my goodness, we ate like kings and we didn't realize it. My mother and dad made liver sausage by the quarts, and we ate that. That was a staple in our house, and I think back and I think, wow, that they call that pate now. And that's what we were raised on. And it was delicious. It was delicious. They would make sausage, and so they had their food, and they milked cows, so my mother made butter, and it was really a pioneer's life. But I don't ever remember, maybe because I was the second youngest, I hadn't heard of any of the hardships. Life was very good for me, I thought. I just kind of rolled along.
And so fast forward to the 1970s when you were among the 5 families that signed up
Yes.
to be involved. Can you tell, you were in your 30s?
Yeah,
How
in
many
my
children
30s.
did you have?
We had 4 children. 3 of them were in school, and Paul, our youngest one, he was at home with us. And so when the family came, we met them at the airport.
This was a widow with
With the 6 children, yes.
With 6 children.
Yes.
What were the circumstances?
You know, I have to honestly say that that's all we knew about the family, was that she was a widow with 6 children, and coming from Vietnam, from the war-torn country. I don't think we had many questions to ask. It was probably self-explanatory. And I truly still believe that. She came with her, 4 of her children came with her the day she arrived in Canada, and a couple of days later her oldest daughter came. And I don't know the circumstances around that either. But you know, we didn't ask, and it was okay. And she had one child that went with his uncle to Australia for a while. So, I mean, families were torn apart, let's face it. So I think Mrs. Tran was very lucky to have the core of her 5 children, and then later on the 6th child came. And when we met them at the airport, the 4 children and Mrs. Tran, what do I recall? They came off the plane, and our sponsorship families and Catholic Social Services were there with us. Alice Cholak was the head of that group, and she had an interpreter, so we had an interpreter. And I think we just we had our children to look after, and they had their kids to look after, and I don't even know how they got from the airport to the little motels and by the Kingsway Mall. There were little units there that they housed the refugees, the boat people, and I don't even know how long we kept them there. Maybe 2 weeks, and then we got them into a suite on 156th Street, and the parish that I don't even recall anyone being the head of the group of the 5. We just phone each other and say, hey, we've got some furniture here, can we get together? And a guy who had a truck, John, he said, yes, I'll be there, and we load up furniture and take it to Mrs. Tran's suite, and got them all established, and got the children in school in September to Sherwood School in the West End at that time. And then I had a friend who lived in the West End, and she took care of the little kids after school.
Was this in Spruce Grove or
No,
Edmonton?
it was in the city. It was in Edmonton.
And so you had to travel from
Yes.
Spruce Grove
Yep.
to take care of these guys.
Yes, yeah. But we didn't even think about that. It was just a way of life. And what else can I say here about?
The initial housing, the first hotel was part of the government
Yes, I would say
services that were
Yes,
provided,
yeah.
and then you guys had
The Catholic
to.
Social Services provided that, and then we got them into a suite, and I'm sure the suite was paid for, and I don't know how long, maybe a couple of months, but Mrs. Tran soon became employed. She was a seamstress, she cleaned, and she wash dishes, and so she had about 3 jobs at one time, keeping her family going. And then as the kids got older, I think they got part-time jobs as well. And I'm not even sure how long they were in that suite on 156th Street. And one of the group of the sponsors was a realtor, and he was looking around, and he kind of arranged and got it that she could get a mortgage, Mrs. Tran. So, you know, I'm not even guessing the timelines. I don't know what the timeline was for that, but he got a mortgage for her, and she moved her family into the townhouse on a 132nd Avenue and 97th Street, and Mrs. Tran is still living in that place.
This was several years after she arrived.
Not several, no, I would say maybe, I can't say it was several years. No, I'm guessing it was a year or maybe just over a year, where they could establish that she had income and that she could handle a mortgage. They arranged that it was a low mortgage, and however realtors can do that. And so she was in her own home, and her children probably had part-time jobs to help pay the bills. And from there, they went to St. Catherine's School from 132nd Avenue and would be 101st Street. They went to St. Catherine's School, and next door was St. Joe's High School, and 2 of the sponsors, like my husband and Hank Zip, were teachers at the high school. And I think Mrs. Tran probably felt kind of comfortable with the children going to St. Catherine's, and knowing that a couple of the sponsors were next door. I think it was comforting for her, and even for my husband and Hank Zip, that they knew that the kids were close by and that they were well taken care of. And they went through the Catholic system, and those children all had post-secondary educations. All Mrs. Tran worked so hard to make sure that her children were educated. And the youngest one, Young, who was 5 years old when she arrived, she became a doctor, and she now is out in Kalmar and has a practice. And before they had their practice, I know she and her husband was also a physician. They went and worked for Doctors Without Borders, and so giving back in that way, you know. Young and the Trans have always been giving back, and I think it's just they just are so grateful. And
How old were the oldest kids when they came?
I would guess that Tang was maybe 19, and then from there 17, 15, and Young was 5. So there was about from 19, I'm guessing. You know, I am sorry I don't know exactly the ages, but I know that Young was 5. And I know that Young and Anne needed a lot of dental work. And so that was kind of my job, being, I think, of the whole group of sponsors, I may have been the only stay-at-home mom at that time. And so I took it upon myself to drive these 2 children to the dentist. And after many years, they told me that, of course, there was no communication because we couldn't speak to each other. I would pick them up, and there was a lot of animation going on, and take them to the dentist. And Young and Anne said, well, we remember that we didn't talk because we couldn't communicate, but you always sang to us. So I don't remember that, but I guess I was trying to fill the quiet moments. And so I'm not sure which was more painful for them, my singing or the dentist, but however, it all worked out really well. And yeah, that was kind of my role. And of course, everyone pitched in for taking them shopping. I know that one of the gals, Adele, she would take them grocery shopping, and she was a good at animating, so she would animate a lot of things that they would need. And yes, it was interesting. It was interesting.
How involved were you, or were the other sponsors in their day-to-day lives at the beginning?
I think they were quite involved. I don't know to what extent, because you know what, we were trying to raise our own children and keep things rolling, and we would touch base. They would socially, I think they would have them over, and I know they must have done all kinds of things for them. But don't forget, Mrs. Tran was a very independent lady in a short period of time, and they didn't need a lot of coddling, really. I just am always amazed.
Did she find her 3 jobs on her own, or with your help?
You know, our family didn't certainly help with that. I don't know who did. Perhaps Catholic Social Services. Maybe they stepped up too and said, hey, these are the things that are available. Yeah, I don't know exactly.
And in terms of financial support, did you have to provide for that?
No, we didn't. And you know, looking back, it's a good thing because we were just all trying to keep our own wolf off the doorstep, you might say, trying to raise our 4 children, and we're a single income family, and you know, driving them here, there, and everywhere, and doing what we could. When I look back at it, I think, well, maybe we didn't really do all that much for them, but not according to them. And they're so grateful. They are so grateful, all of them. And Mrs. Tran can be very, very proud of what she did with her children. I know that it wasn't easy. Well, you can imagine, with 6 children, and I think she looked after her family with a firm hand and was very successful with doing that, really. And it had to be that way because I'm sure, like every other family, they had their hills and their valleys. And they were probably a lot more than what we realized. But wow, they're just so grateful. And they invite us to their weddings, and all the sponsors get a first-class seat up front. And they always mention that the sponsors, if it wasn't for the sponsors, we wouldn't be here. I mean, I was just to see Nyung last week, and I was in her office, and I was looking around. I said, oh, wow, Nyung, what a nice office. She said, yes. Thanks to you. I'm thinking, Nyong, thanks to you. You did all the hard work, but they just never forget that. It's amazing. Just a beautiful, beautiful family.
So, do you have, were there obstacles or struggles for you or the other families that were doing the sponsoring?
I honestly don't feel that there were any obstacles or struggles. I would say that the biggest struggle was to find time. Time was the obstacle, if that's what you want to call it. You know, there was a fair amount of running around and doing this, that, and moving, and so on and so forth. But I have to say that's the only thing that I felt. And struggles and obstacles, you know, the family was so grateful for everything you did that there were never any disagreements or anything that you felt that, oh, they didn't appreciate that, because they appreciated everything. Absolutely everything. We couldn't have had a better family. Honestly, we couldn't have.
Were there differences within your group about, you know, where to steer them or how much to?
No, I don't think so. Initially, I'd have to say at the parish level, there definitely were people who were not for the sponsorship. There were definitely that. But we overcame that. They just went into the background, and they had voiced their opinion, like most people do nowadays, and said they're going to take our jobs. And they actually said that right in church when Father was talking about bringing the refugees in. Why are we doing this? They're going to take our jobs. Wow, we're hearing that all the time, aren't we? And what would we do without them? What could we do without them? So those, I can't say that I ever heard any other negative. Nothing other than that. That was negative at the parish level. And as far as our friends or anyone, I can't say that I heard anything negative. If they thought it, they didn't say it. And I always bragged about this wonderful family and how well they were doing. I still do. I still do. This is a topic of conversation very often, talking about our Vietnamese family,
And you remain in their lives.
and we remain in their lives. Absolutely, we do. And you know, it's not every week or every month or you know, but Nhung, for example, has her fundraiser every year for the Vietnamese orphans, and a group of us always go to that fundraiser, and so we remain in their lives. It's just it just is that way, and they're just so wonderful to have as friends, you know, and we appreciate them, and we respect them, and they respect us. And like I say, we weren't always at each other's doorstep because everyone was busy raising children.
So it sounds like you do talk about your
Oh,
experiences.
I talk, you know, I talk about it often, and I think now, did these people hear the story before? Because I may be repeating myself, but everyone that I tell the story to, I have to say they are in awe. They say, wow. And I know that there are a lot of refugees who were sponsored, even privately, who aren't always in the lives of their sponsors afterwards. Because I remember going to the hairdresser one time, and there was a Vietnamese gal there, and of course I was telling her the story, and she said, oh, and are you still in touch with this family? And I said, oh, absolutely. And she was very surprised about that, because she too was a boat person, and she said, our sponsors didn't stay in touch with us. They sponsored us and we got on our feet, but they didn't stay in touch with us. So I think this friendship that has lasted, and it is a great friendship with every one of the sponsors. They have their own connection. And some have a better connection than others. I wouldn't call ours the best connection. I know there are families that even have a better connection. But I'm sure that you know, I did miss a part here in going to the airport where one of the little gals and one of our sponsors gave Nhung a doll. And this doll has been very precious to Nhung, and she has kept it all these years. And you know, I think she always reminds Adrian Thurston how happy she was to receive the doll from her. And you'll probably hear the story again that the doll is now in Pier 21 doing a tour of Canada with the museum. So this is a very historic doll that Adrian gave to Nhung. And as I think I explained to you before, Adrian is now, she is in a long-term care with MS, but I know that Nhung keeps in touch with her too. You know, it's just all around, pardon me, it's all around beautiful friendship. So there's one part of the story that I kind of skipped over, and I wanted to just to remind us of when we went to the airport initially to pick up the Tran family. Of course, Mrs. Tran came off the plane with her 4 children, and one of the sponsors' families, there was a little gal, she was about 8 years old, she had a doll, and she gave that to Nhung. And that doll has been topic of conversation many, many times, and it has been just a keepsake for Nhung. And apparently now that doll is at Pier 21 in the museum, and it is doing a tour of Canada somehow. I don't know how a doll can do that, but anyhow, this doll is touring Canada with Pier 21. I'm thinking, wow, who would have ever thought that small, kind gesture would move into something this big? But it's a beautiful story, and I know that Nhung is proud of that doll, and the little gal who gave it to her is proud of it, and so is this little gal's mother is very proud. So it's a nice story for all of them.
That's a beautiful story.
And another thing I was going to mention, when we were moving the Trans, you know, we would sometimes have the Nhung and Anne especially with us, because they were the youngest and they could travel in the cars. We didn't have seat belts. I don't think in those days you could put as many people in the back seat and travel around. And we were moving them, and On this one particular day, I have to say that there was a couple of sponsors besides ourselves moving furniture, and then we decided, oh, it was lunchtime. Let's treat the kids to lunch. So what better way in the early 80s to treat a child to lunch, and our own children too, but to McDonald's. So we went to McDonald's and got everyone their nice little hamburger and their fries and their drink. And I was sitting across from Anne, and we were all enjoying our hamburgers and fries, and Anne was sitting there eating, and she couldn't stand this hamburger. She was almost bringing up because of she wasn't used to that food, and I'm thinking, oh, what a mistake that was. We never even thought of them not being used to a McDonald's hamburger, but I will never forget the look on that little girl's face. Just, she was trying to be polite and eating it, and yet she was almost bringing it up on her plate. So, I don't know. I should ask Anne now if she ever eats McDonald's.
To close with, I'll ask you if what you think future generations of Canadians can learn from your experiences.
Well, they can learn a great deal, but will they? That's the other question. But I think all of the sponsors we know, they're advocates for helping immigrants, and so we should be. And there's a lot of good people out there who are doing this, and this will continue. There will always be good people who are looking after immigrants coming into this country. You go to the Syrians. We were out at the airport when they came in, and our daughter and her son, our grandson, was out there, so they could kind of get a taste of that kind of community as well. And I think that kindness is contagious. You know, even our grandson, he sees that you're going out to the airport to meet some newcomers. Wow, I think that would be a lasting effect on them. And as far as talking about it constantly in our families, we don't, unless it's something that, you know, we're talking to Nyung, or our daughter might say, oh, I was talking with Nyung, or Nyung's on Facebook and I was, you know, her friend, and so on and so on. But I think the Canadian people can learn a great deal. We need them. We do need them. And I know that I've heard lots of stories that we don't, but I'm not one of those that think that way, nor is my family. You know, it's part of life, and wonderful. And I think these people must wonder how welcome they are, because there's a lot of people that make them welcome, and that's wonderful.
It sounds like the Syrians that you mentioned, are they sponsored by your parish?
Not by our parish, no. It was by Nyung, was the catalyst in the Syrians, and she and another one of our sponsor families. I know that one of the ladies was much more involved. I can't say that I've ever been involved in another family, except that we did bring them some vegetables from our garden. You know, they were in the West End, and we brought them some vegetables from our garden, so it was just a small gesture. But even small gestures grow into huge things, don't they?
And the tradition continues.
Yes, and the tradition continues, absolutely. Absolutely, and that's where paying it forward is so important. Like in the 70s and the early 80s, that's what we were doing. We paid it forward before it was even a cliche, you know. And now it's common language. But yes, I think our children learn a lot from this. I've got a son-in-law and a daughter-in-law who work with the homeless people. I mean, that is a kind gesture too. I mean, that's their job, but it's still not everyone can do that. Not everyone can do that and treat them with kindness. And so that's really important to look at those less fortunate.
Thank you very much for sharing your stories with us.
Well, you're welcome, and I hope that it will help. And I enjoyed being here, and thank you for asking me. Thanks for asking me, and I hope I did the Vietnamese family proud, because they certainly have done us proud.
Thank you. So I have just one question of clarification.
Mm-hmm.
You said that the children went to Catholic school where your husband taught. Were they Catholics as well, this family?
No, the Tran family were not Catholics, but I think because it was the Catholic Social Services who were the group that were basically sponsoring them, and it was the Catholic parish who was looking after them, it was just kind of a natural formation for them to go to a Catholic school. And that worked fine, and there were never any expectations from the group in any way for the family to convert to Catholicism. They went to St. Catherine's, they went to St. Joe's. Never once did I hear that anyone thought they should become Catholic, and I'm proud of that point too, because I think that wasn't a part of why we did this. And I think, I hope Mrs. Tran knows that there were no expectations whatsoever. So,
Thank you very much.
you're welcome. Thank you.